Hey everyone, Steve Miller here with an Asia Now feature from the September 11, 2015 edition of Asia News Weekly. In this podcast, I speak with Jonathan Miller at the EastWest Institute about if unifying the Koreas is really in China's best interest. One of the most popular topics in Korean politics is that of unification. In fact, the office that deals most frequently with North Korea isn't the Foreign Minister's office or even the Joint Chiefs of Staff, despite both countries being technically still at war. No, it's the Ministry of Unification that continues to pursue plans to move the country towards unification, despite a growing number of South Koreans who feel less and less in common with those north of the DMZ. So it's fairly interesting when South Korean President Park Geun-hye proclaims that unification can happen as early as next year and asked Chinese President Xi Jinping to actively work on making one Korea a reality. Which actually brings up a fairly good question. Is Korea unification something that China could stand behind? To help answer that question, I recently spoke with Jonathan Miller, East Asia Fellow at the EastWest Institute. I began our conversation by asking him why Park is making such a big push for unification now.
I also am a bit, confused on that. And, I think that a lot of people who have been watching inter-Korea politics over the last few years, it's always a hope. It's always something with every new administration that, is something that we feel like should be pursued, that avenue. But it's kind of the balance that has me thrown a little bit off on it. As you mentioned, Park has been kind of pushing that. I find the balance of kind of hedging between that and deterrence is kind of it hasn't really been a perfectly tuned balance since she started. And I even think about, I know we'll get to China later, but I even think about her recent trip to China for the military parade. And although a lot of analysts tended to see that in an anti-Japan light, I think it was more framed around North Korea and China's relationship with North Korea. So
let's go ahead and dive into that because, while she was there, she explicitly asked President Xi to help foster better ties with Pyongyang and to help unify the peninsula.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is something that is interesting. I think, as I said, you would see a lot of the commentary in the U.S. at the time, especially, in some of the circles that I'm in on Japan focus, where people are seeing that as more of a slight to the U.S., a slight to Japan. But if you see it through the lens of the Park administration, I think they were framing it more to see what China could do with its relationship with Pyongyang, and whether they felt that they could have any influence over North Korea, whether it's persuading them to come back to the six-party talks or otherwise. My opinion is that I feel like, would that be something in China's interest? I'm not sure that it would be. I know that China also has interest in a denuclearized Korean peninsula, but as far as reunification, it's something that under what terms? I think we've discussed this in a previous podcast, but it's always the terms on what a reunification would be for China. And Beijing is very wary of reunification that would essentially be the current regime in South Korea at its border with its U.S. ally.
Now, this is still something that South Korea is going to continue to work for, continue to ask for assistance for. And yes, we know we don't want China to be put in a position where they're confronted, like say, with South Korea, with a U.S. ally there. Are there any real benefits to China having a unified peninsula?
Well, I think that there definitely are a number of benefits if things were kind of going right and under the conditions that China felt were favorable to it. One of the biggest stories of the past few years, aside from Korea trying to lobby for China's help on North Korea, is just the improved ties writ large between South Korea and China, economic terms and political terms. If the conditions were right and favorable to China with a reunification, the potential for even better ties with with a new unified Korea is something that down the road could be possible. I think sometimes it gets overinflated that China has great ties with North Korea and has had troubled relations with South Korea. I think things have really tilted, especially in the last 5 to 10 years in that regard. So I think there definitely would be a benefit, but it all depends on what the end game would look like with that unification.
Speaking of North Korea, we've entered and exited already another typical cycle of Pyongyang tension on the peninsula. And, as we've mentioned, China really doesn't like to see that. It creates a lot of problems, not only for Beijing, but for the entire region. Do you think we'll see China taking a more active role in trying to urge Kim Jong-un to reduce that propagation of cycle in the future?
Yeah, I do believe we will. I believe that is, again, one of the biggest drivers of South Korea's engagement with China right now. I mean, of course, there's all the economics and everything else, but I think every time that Park's meeting with Xi Jinping, that's something that's coming up. So I think that China will try to do what it can, but at the same point, it's gonna balance that with what it feels like it is in its interest, what sort of level of pressure on North Korea is in its interests. And then, maybe we can kind of get into this next, but it's just the limits of what is even possible that's something that I think, frankly, has been overplayed a lot. As though, what are the extents of China's leverage over the North?
Well, that's really the general consensus to many outside this area, is that China serves as North Korea's benefactor, its protector, that exudes some kind of massive control over North Korea. But if we look at the past, we've seen multiple nuclear tests, we've seen missile launches, and to date, Kim Jong-un still hasn't been to Beijing to meet Xi. I mean, does Beijing still have any kind of influence over what Kim is doing in Pyongyang?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely. I mean, if any country does have that influence, it would be China. But as I said before, and as you've kind of alluded to as well, I mean, the idea that China is essentially the puppet master there is very dated. I mean, decades ago that might have been the case, but the amount of control over North Korea has really been reduced in recent years, and a lot of it it aligns with the directions that both countries are going. I mean, North Korea has stayed on a path that China has diverged from for several years now, and is much more aligned in many respects to the West. Even though you hear all the stories about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the rivalries butting heads with the U.S. In the Asia Pacific, but in most terms, China has been drifting more towards the West and further away from the ideals of something like North Korea. So I feel like it's a limited relationship compared to what it used to be, for sure.
One of the things that's going to be coming up towards the end of the year is, of course, the expected Trilateral meeting with South Korea, Japan, and China. And, of course, everyone expects North Korea to be one of the agenda items. Do you think that meeting with the three heads of state can actually affect any kind of change in how the world deals with North Korea? Or is it still just wait and see what the next, quote-unquote, crazy thing Kim does?
Well, I think that meeting will have some symbolism for sure on the North Korean issue. I mean, but to put that in even broader context, I mean, as you know, we've had some discussions on China, Japan, South Korea, Japan relations. I mean, that meeting in itself has so many different angles to it, and is such a political meeting in itself, with all of the different tensions in that triangle, that I think whether there's going to be real substantive discussions on North Korea that really go beyond anything that's been happening, through other forums, I don't really know. Maybe eventually, ideally, could get to that point, but I feel like it's going to be more the symbolism, and that meeting really is going to be the opportunity, especially for South Korea and Japan, hopefully, to have their first summit. So I don't know if I see that as really an opportunity to affect real large change on North Korea.
Okay. one last question. It's widely expected that sometime in the near future we'll see a fourth nuclear test or perhaps a long-range missile test. What do you think China's response will be? They've said don't do it, but could this finally be let's just say the straw that breaks the camel's back and force Beijing to react more harshly than it has in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think about what China's response could be. I mean, I guess a lot of it would depend, but yeah, if it's another nuclear test or another long range missile test, obviously China is fed up with those provocations as well, and has voiced that and has even signed on to previous sanctions. I think there's always that tendency to kind of start taking step by step and seeing where that kind of frustration would just, as you say, break the camel's back. But my feeling is Beijing also realizes, despite which pressures it will put on the North, that it at this point it's not in its strategic interests to completely cut North Korea off. So I think that there's, as we've talked about before, again in previous sessions on the buffer state and many other issues with regards to its support with the North. So I don't think that they're quite at that point yet where they're really willing to almost effectively sever the relationship. But I feel like that it is quite possible that especially with the trend in relations with South Korea, that they would feel more falling in line with sanctions.
All right. My guest this week, Jonathan Miller, East Asia Fellow at the EastWest Institute. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Steve.
Now, before I go, I do have one question for you, and that is this. Does China need North Korea? I hope you'll take an opportunity to share your opinion with me. This episode of Asia Now features extended content of material originally broadcast as part of the Asian News Weekly podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You can also keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please drop us an email message. That address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.